Why did Persia become Iran? In March of 1935, a king erased a civilization's name. With a single signature, the word Persia vanished from the world map. 3,000 years of identity gone overnight. But here's the part history rarely explains. Persia did not disappear because it was conquered. Persia disappeared because its own ruler chose to erase the name. And in 2026, science is finally uncovering the deeper truth behind that decision. This is the story of the erased empire. Welcome back to Whispered Chronicles, Echoes of Forgotten Lore. We have visited the impossible before. We stood inside the iron city of Tugun Blue, that fortress buried in the Uzbek steppe. A place where armies of laborers smelted iron on a scale the ancient world had no right to achieve. We traced its foundries. We measured its silence. We walked the living labyrinth of the Maya, that breathtaking, jungle-strangled network of causeways and channels and ceremonial plazas where a civilization didn't just build its world, it choreographed it. Every avenue a sentence. Every pyramid a punctuation mark in a grammar. The conquistadors never learned to read. We climbed, metaphorically, into the molten crown of Scotland, those volcanic intrusions, those ancient calderas that the Picts and the Scots and the Gaels stamped their stories into, as though geology itself were a kind of inheritance. In every case, we were looking at the same fundamental human impulse, the need to leave a mark, physical mark. Stone, iron, canal water, carved basalt. These were people who shouted their identity into the landscape and trusted the earth to remember what they screamed. But tonight, we go somewhere different. Tonight, we examine a mark that was erased. Tonight, we don't study what civilizations built. We study what one civilization chose to destroy about itself, voluntarily, deliberately, with a fountain pen, a diplomatic telegram, and the quiet fury of a king who had decided that the name his people had worn for 3,000 years had become somehow a cage. We are not talking about conquest. No empire marched in and renamed these people. They renamed themselves. And the question that 2026's most advanced genomic science and satellite archaeology is only now beginning to answer fully is this. When a civilization erases its own name, what exactly dies? March 1935. Picture a room in Tehran, not a battlefield. Not a throne room draped in conquest banners. A desk, paper, ink, the administrative machinery of a modernizing state, humming quietly around a man who has decided that words matter more than armies. Reza Shah Pahlavi, soldier turned monarch. A man who clawed his way from Cossack brigade officer to the peacock throne through sheer, iron-forged will issues a directive, a diplomatic circular, quiet in tone, seismic in consequence. The circular instructs foreign governments and international bodies to cease using the name Persia when referring to his nation. Henceforth, the country would be known only as Iran. It's not Persia. Not the Persian Empire. Not the land of Cyrus and Darius. Iran and the world. Largely complied. Now here's what most history textbooks do with this moment. They reduce it to a paragraph. Reza Shah requested the name change. The League of Nations obliged. The end. But that framing is almost criminally superficial. Because what happened in March of 1935 was not a bureaucratic rename. It was not like changing the name of a street or a postal district. It was something far more intimate and far more violent. It was a surgical removal of a legacy. Think about what the name Persia carried in 1935. 3,000 years of literary sediment. The word itself, Persia, derived from Pars or Parsa in Old Persian, the ancient heartland province in what is now Fars in southern Iran. The Greeks had encountered this region and its people, and their word Persis had traveled west through Latin, through medieval European scholarship, through the Enlightenment's love affair with the exotic East, and had arrived in the 20th century, dragging an enormous, glittering, suffocating cargo of associations, carpets, poetry, Omar Khayyam and his wine jug, Shahrazada's labyrinthine tales, miniature paintings of princes on horseback, mosques with turquoise domes catching the desert light. Beautiful, every one. And to Reza Shah's engineers, his military planners, his Panarian ideologues, absolutely catastrophically useless. Pause. There is a quiet violence in being known only for your beauty. It is the violence of the museum case. The thing inside is real. It was once alive, perhaps terrifying, certainly complex. But the glass around it, the label, the scholarly pamphlet, the admiring visitor reduces it, fixes it, pins it like a butterfly. Countries like people sometimes discover that the name others gave them is not a tribute. It is a taxidermy. And when they realize this, the most desperate of them reach for a scalpel. To understand why Persia became a burden, you have to understand what Edward Said would later call Orientalism, and more specifically, you have to understand how that Orientalist lens had been focused for centuries on the Iranian plateau. The West had a Persia it was deeply romantically in love with. Poets like Hafez and Rumi had been translated, adapted, consumed. Fitzgerald's Luce. Gorgeous rendering of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam had sold hundreds of thousands of copies across the English-speaking world by the late 19th century. Persian carpet motifs adorned Victorian parlors. Persian miniature painting was collected, catalogued, exhibited. Persia was beautiful. Persia was ancient. Persia was, and this is the crucial word, past. To the European diplomatic and economic imagination of the early 20th century, Persia was a classical civilization, like Greece or Rome, a thing to be admired in retrospect, a place that had produced great things, past tense, not a place that was building great things, a place with railways or refineries or strategic ambitions or a sovereign future. And this was not merely an aesthetic insult, it had real geopolitical teeth, because the British had been treating Persia as if it were a geographical inheritance, a buffer zone, an oil reservoir, a chessboard square. For over a century, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, founded in 1908, was extracting the country's liquid wealth with a stunning, almost theatrical indifference to the sovereignty of the people under whose land that oil sat. The name on the company's letterhead said it all: Anglo-Persian, not Anglo-Iranian, not a partnership between equals, a colonial compound word where the first half held the power and the second half held the geography. Reza Shah watched all of this. He'd watched it, in fact, with the focused, slightly cold attention of a man who had risen through military ranks by noticing things others missed. He saw that Persia, the word, was doing active damage. It was a word that, in Western mouths, came attached to the assumption of passivity, of quaintness, of a nation content to be picturesque. He needed a different word, a word that meant something else entirely. He chose Iran. Iran is not a new word. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the 1935 directive, and the thing most casually overlooked. Iran, in various forms, had been in continuous use among the Persian-speaking peoples for over 2 millennia. It derives from Ariana, an Avestan term meaning land of the Aryan, or more precisely, land of the nobles. In its original context, Aryan did not describe a race. It referred to a linguistic and cultural family of Indo-Iranian peoples, a meaning that was later distorted by 20th century political ideologies. The Shanum Ferdowsi's monumental 11th century national epic, essentially the Iranian Iliad and Odyssey fused into 100,000 couplets, uses the term Iran throughout. As the name the Iranians had always called themselves, Persia was the name the Greeks gave them. Iran was the name they gave themselves. So what Reza Shah was really doing in 1935 was not inventing a new identity. He was reclaiming the indigenous one. He was saying, stop calling us by the Greek reduction. Call us by our own ancient name. But the timing of the reclamation is what makes it complicated. Because 1935 was not just any year. Europe was burning with a very particular kind of nationalism. The ideology of racial Aryanism, grotesquely distorted from its actual linguistic and anthropological origins, was surging through Germany and infecting political movements across the continent. Reza Shah's decision to emphasize the Aryan root of Iran, Ariana Veja, the mythological homeland of the noble people, was not made in a vacuum. His advisors, many of them educated in European universities and deeply influenced by German Romantic nationalism, saw an opportunity to reframe the Iranian nation within a global vocabulary of racial modernity. This was, to put it plainly, a dangerous game, and the 1935 intellectual backlash was fierce. The resistance to the name change was not merely foreign, It was internal, profound, and in many cases, heartbreaking. Within Iran itself, among poets, historians, literary scholars, and the custodians of the Persian classical tradition, the directive landed. Like a cold pronouncement from a king who had confused progress with amputation, the Persian literary tradition was not merely an art form. It was the connective tissue of Iranian identity across more than 1,000 years of invasion, dynastic collapse, religious transformation, and political upheaval. When the Arabs swept across the plateau in the 7th century and shattered the Sassanid Empire, it was the Persian language, battered, reshaped, but unbroken, that preserved the continuity of Iranian civilization. When the Mongols descended in the 13th century and reduced great cities to fields of skulls, it was Persian poetry that kept the memory of what had been alive in the mouths of the survivors. Persia, to these scholars, was not a Western cage, it was a library, irreplaceable archive of cultural memory embedded in a single word. To erase Persia from diplomatic correspondence was, in their view, to sever the international world's connection to that library. To replace it with Iran, a perfectly legitimate name. Yes, but one that carried none of the accumulated literary and cultural weight in foreign ears, was to opt for a blank page when you had at your disposal a gilded manuscript. Philosopher and literary critic Bediüzzaman Firuzanfar, one of the preeminent scholars of classical Persian literature in the early 20th century, reportedly expressed private dismay at the directive. Though overt dissent under Reza Shah's increasingly authoritarian rule was rarely safe, others argued more structurally that by erasing the name Persia, Iran was abandoning precisely the kind of soft power that smaller nations desperately needed in a world run by great powers. The Persian literary tradition had given Iran prestige, a form of cultural capital that translated across borders. Hafez was read in Germany. Rumi was celebrated in India. The Rubaiyat had conquered Victorian England without a single soldier. What would Iran, the blank new word, offer in its place? Reza Shah's answer roughly was a railway. He was building one of the most ambitious rail networks in the Middle East. He was modernizing the army, the judiciary, the universities. He was replacing robes with suits and turbans with Pahlavi caps. He was, in his own vision, industrializing an identity. And that industrial future, he had decided, could not be dragged forward while carrying the romantic weight of Persia around its neck. Pause. Consider what it means to outrun your own mythology. Every civilization reaches a moment where the stories it has told about itself become either a fuel or an anchor. The same legend that once gave a people the courage to endure can, in a different century, give their colonizers the justification to condescend. The same beauty that made you beloved can make you dismissible. Persia was not erased because it was ugly. It was erased because it was too beautiful. And beauty, in the grammar of industrial modernity, was another word for ornament. And no nation in 1935 could afford to be ornamental. Now, let us leave 1935 for a moment and climb into the present. Because what makes this story extraordinary, what elevates it from fascinating history to something genuinely vertiginous, is what 2026 is. Scientific instruments are now revealing about the very foundations of the name that Reza Shah reclaimed. Earlier this year, an international consortium of geneticists from institutions in Tehran, Oxford, Leipzig, and Seoul published what is now being called the Iranian Plateau Genomic Atlas, the most comprehensive DNA mapping of the region's ancient and modern populations ever assembled. Over 12,000 samples, ranging from 7,000-year-old skeletal remains to contemporary citizens of 23 Iranian provinces. The results confirmed, with a precision that previous archaeological inference could only gesture toward, the actual migration paths of the people who called themselves Ariana, the nobles. The Proto-Iranian pastoralists who descended from the Pontic Caspian, steppe around 2000 BCE, carrying with them the ancestral Indo-European language that would eventually branch into Sanskrit, Vestan, Old Persian, and a dozen other tongues. The genomic fingerprints are unambiguous. The isotopic markers in the bone collagen of individuals buried in early Iron Age sites across the plateau sites, near modern-day Hamadan, Persepolis. And the shores of Lake Urmia show the distinctive steppe ancestry signature of these migrating Iranian populations, layering over an older, deeply rooted Zagros farmer genetic substrate. In other words, the name Iran, Ariana, land of the nobles, was not mythological propaganda. It was, the DNA confirms, a genuine memory. A genetic reality encoded in language before the concept of genetics existed. The Medes, the Persians, the Parthians, the Bactrians, these were not separate peoples who happened to speak related languages. They were branches of a demonstrably connected biological and cultural family, spreading across the plateau from a common ancestral migration, carrying the name Ariana like a genomic inheritance. What Reza Shah reclaimed in 1935 was, it turns out, the scientifically accurate name, the internal name, the name that the bones remember. But of course he didn't know that then. He was operating on ideology, on political instinct, on the advice of nationalist scholars. The science that would vindicate his linguistic choice was 90 years away. And there is a second revelation from 2026 that reframes the entire story, the Achaemenid Royal Road. 2,500 years ago, Darius the Great, Darius the First, Dryavo, who holds firm the good, built something that has no adequate modern analog. A road, or rather, the road. Stretching approximately 2,700 kilometers from Susa, in the southwest, to Sardis, in what is now western Turkey. It was the longest and most sophisticated communication infrastructure in the ancient world. But here's what the 2026 satellite archaeology program has revealed that we did not fully appreciate before. Using a combination of high-resolution, multispectral imaging from the European Space Agency's Sentinel-6 constellation and newly processed LiDAR data from the JAXA Earth Observation Research Center. Archaeologists at the University of Tehran and the Oriental Institute in Chicago have now mapped the Royal Road with a granularity that ground surveys simply cannot achieve. And what they have found is not merely a road. It was a network. The Royal Road had relay stations. It's Perdazish in Old Persian, positioned at intervals of roughly 25 to 30 kilometers. Each station was not simply a place to change horses, though that was one function. They were administrative nodes, postal repositories, intelligence hubs. The satellite imaging has now identified the faint, ghost-like foundations of dozens of previously unknown stations, particularly in the Anatolian and Zagros segments of the route. More extraordinary still, the new imaging has revealed what appear to be standardized architectural footprints across all the stations, a unified design language imposed from the center. Persepolis was not just a palace complex. It was a server farm, a broadcasting tower, and the Royal Road was its cable. The Achaemenid Empire communicated at a speed that would not be matched in that region for over 2,000 years. The royal couriers, the Angram, immortalized by Herodotus, in a phrase that would later be adopted, almost word for word, by the United States Postal Service, cover the entire length of the road in approximately 7 days. 7 days for 2,700 kilometers on horseback. Through desert, through mountain pass, through river ford. This was not just logistics. This was geopolitical semiotics. The Royal Road was the Persian Empire's language of power, a physical syntax that said, "We are everywhere." Simultaneously, and our knowledge moves faster than your armies. The Achaemenid bureaucracy that maintained this system was, in its own era, as sophisticated as any modern administrative state. Clay tablets recovered from the Persepolis Fortification Archive, tens of thousands of them, recording ration, allocations, labor payments, and administrative orders reveal a state apparatus of stunning complexity. Workers of dozens of nationalities tracked, fed, paid, and accounted for. A royal treasury with standardized weights and accounting procedures. A legal system that, remarkably, recognized the rights of women to receive wages and rations at parity with men in many labor categories. This was Persia. Not the carpet, not the poem, not the decorative motif on a Victorian mantelpiece. This was an empire that ran the world's first data stream, that fed tens of thousands of workers through a centralized supply chain, that linked the Aegean Sea to the Hindu Kush with a communication network of almost algorithmic efficiency. And the name Persia, in the Western imagination of 1935, carried precisely none of this. There is something deeply sorrowful about being misremembered by those who claim to admire you. The Orientalist West that cherished Persia had performed a selective memory, keeping the poetry. Discarding the engineering, keeping the mysticism, discarding the statecraft. They had, in essence, curated an Iran that could not threaten them. An Iran that was safely, beautifully dead. When Reza Shah changed the name, he was not rejecting his civilization. He was rejecting the version of his civilization that his admirers had assembled. The version that served their comfort rather than his sovereignty. The tragedy is that in reaching for a modern name, he may have inadvertently buried the very evidence of ancient modernity that would have made his argument most powerfully. Sometimes the cure carries the same blindness as the disease. March 1935 added one mask, but 1979 added another. The Islamic Revolution of 1979, the overthrow of Mohammad Reza Shah, Reza Shah's son, and the establishment of the Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini was, among many other things, a second radical rewriting of Iranian identity. If Reza Shah's 1935 move had been an attempt to decolonize the name by Aryanizing it, pulling it away from the Orientalist West and toward an indigenous, pre-Islamic, Panarian modernity than 1979 was, in some ways, a counter-revolution of identity. It rejected the Pahlavi project of Western-facing, secular nationalism, and replaced it with a third layer, the Islamic Republic. Now the country had three names operating simultaneously. There was Persia, the ancient romantic name that still lived in Western museums and poetry anthologies, increasingly disconnected from any living political reality. There was Iran, the secular nationalist name, associated with the Pahlavi dynasty, with the Shah, with the White Revolution's modernization program, with Savak and the CIA, and the whole contested. Painful architecture of Cold War geopolitics. And there was the Islamic Republic of Iran, theocratic state apparatus, that had grafted a revolutionary Shia identity onto the country's secular nationalist name, creating a compound identity that was and remains internally contradictory in ways that its architects have never fully resolved. Because here is the paradox that 2026 archaeology is now making impossible to ignore. The Islamic Republic, which draws much of its symbolic legitimacy from a specifically Islamic Iranian identity, rules over a population whose deepest cultural roots, as the Genomic Atlas now confirms, predate Islam by at least 2,500 years. The pre-Islamic Iranian civilization, Zoroastrian, Achaemenid, Sassanid, is not a footnote to Iranian identity. It is genetically and archaeologically the primary text. The Nowruz festival, the Persian New Year, celebrated at the spring equinox, has survived every dynastic collapse, every religious revolution, every foreign invasion. The Islamic Republic tried in its early years to suppress it, or at least to de-emphasize it as a pre-Islamic relic. The attempt was a spectacular failure. Nowruz was simply too deeply embedded in the population's sense of self to be ideologically dislodged. It predates the name Iran. It predates the name Persia. It predates the Achaemenids. It is, if the archaeologists are right, a continuous cultural practice reaching back to the earliest agricultural communities on the Iranian plateau. Communities whose genomic descendants are still unmistakably in the population today. The 2026 Genomic Atlas has, in this sense, performed an act of extraordinary political disruption, because it has provided for the first time with full scientific authority a picture of the primal Iran. The Iran beneath the Pahlavi mask, beneath the Islamic Republic mask, beneath even the Achaemenid mask, the Iran of the plateau farmers and the steppe migrants who fused together 4,000 years ago to create the cultural and biological foundation of everything that came after. And that primal Iran answers to no particular political identity currently in power. What does it mean to peel back these layers? In 2026, the satellite archaeology of the Royal Road and the genomic mapping of the plateau are doing something that no political revolution has managed. They are providing a factual substrate beneath the identity wars. They are saying, with the cold, patient authority of data, here is what was actually here, before anyone decided what it should mean. The Royal Road didn't belong to Achaemenid nationalism or Islamic universalism or Pahlavi Panarianism. It was built by human beings with an engineering problem and an imperial appetite, and it worked. It moved information faster than any competing system on Earth. That is a fact. It is inscribed in the satellite data. It will not be revised by any future revolution. The genomic migrations of the Iranian peoples, the Great Steppe, dispersal of 2000 BCE, that seeded the Iranian plateau with the ancestors of the Medes and the Persians and the Parthians, did not happen in service of any modern political project. They happened because pastoralists followed grass and water and the slow gravitational pull of warmer latitudes. That is a fact. It is inscribed in the isotopic markers of 4,000-year-old bones. It will not be redacted. This perhaps is the most haunting thing about the entire story of Persia becoming Iran. The name changed. The political architecture changed. The ideological superstructure changed. 3 times in 90 years, the identity of this nation has been surgically rearranged at the level of self-presentation, governance, and symbolic order. And underneath all of it, unmoved, undestroyed, patient as geology, the actual civilization persists. The actual people persist. Carrying in their DNA the story of a migration so ancient it predates writing. Carrying in their cultural memory a fire festival and a New Year's celebration that no caliph and no shah and no supreme leader has managed to extinguish. The name Persia was removed from the diplomatic record in 1935, but Persia, the living reality, the accumulated human experience, the 10,000-year project of civilization on the Iranian plateau, did not die. It simply stopped answering to that name. So what is the 2026 forensic truth behind the name change? Here's what the evidence tells us, assembled from the diplomatic archives, the genomic atlas, the satellite archaeology, the literary history, and the long, aching record of a civilization navigating its own survival. Reza Shah Pahlavi did not kill Persia. He attempted to free it from a Western definition that had become functionally colonial, a definition that admired the ruins and dismissed the living nation. It celebrated the poetry and extracted the oil that built museums to house Persian antiquities while building pipelines to drain Persian resources. This method was imperfect. His timing was contaminated by the toxic racialism of 1930s European politics. His authoritarian implementation silenced the very scholars whose nuance might have made the transition less traumatic. The intellectual backlash was legitimate and its concerns were prophetic. But the impulse was not erasure. It was reclamation. And the science of 2026 has done something remarkable. It has validated the reclamation while complicating the politics. Yes, the people of the Iranian plateau descend from the Iranian migrations. The name Iran is, in the deepest genomic sense, accurate. But those same Iranian migrants fused with Zagros farmers and created something that transcended any single identity category. The primal Iran is not purely Aryan. It is not purely Islamic. It is not purely Achaemenid. It is a layered, complex, genetically heterogeneous civilization that resists any single ideological framing. Which means that every name, Persia, Iran, Islamic Republic, is simultaneously true and insufficient. Which means that the country that diplomats today address as the Islamic Republic of Iran is, at its deepest level, a civilization still in the process of remembering what it actually is. The Royal Road carried messages from Susa to Sardis in 7 days. The genomic data moves at the speed of publication. Both are doing the same thing the couriers of Darius once did, carrying information across impossible distances, insisting that the center holds, that there is a coherent identity at the heart of all this complexity. Whether the center holds in the political sense, in the cultural sense, in the sense that any nation can sustain a coherent self-understanding, it's not a question the satellite or the genome can answer. That one remains for the living. We have asked tonight what dies when a civilization erases its own name. And the answer, it turns out, is less than you'd think, and more than you'll ever fully account for. The word Persia no longer appears on diplomatic correspondence. The carpets are still woven. Hafez is still read. The Nowruz fire still burns on the eve of the spring equinox. In cities that have changed their names and their governments and their ideological architectures, 6 times since the first farmer on the Zagros plateau looked at the returning light and decided it was worth celebrating. Names are the clothes, civilizations where they matter, God. They matter. They determine how the world sees you, how trade flows. How wars are justified, how romanticization becomes colonization, becomes resistance, becomes revolution. Names are never merely words, but underneath the clothes, the body persists. The Iranian plateau has been home to continuous human civilization for at least 10,000 years. It has been called many things. It has called itself many things. It has been conquered, divided, converted, revolutionized, and sanctioned. It has been curated by Orientalists and weaponized by nationalists, and governed by theocrats and admired by poets who never went there. And in 2026, for the first time, we can read its actual autobiography, not the one written by its rulers, but the one written by its biology. Its ancient roads, its buried administrative tablets, its festival fires. And the autobiography says, "We were here before you named us. We will be here after." That is not a political statement. It is a geological one. And geology, as we've learned on this channel, from the Iron City to the Molten Crown to the Living Labyrinth, does not negotiate. It simply endures. Do you think Persia should still be called Persia today, or was the name Iran the right choice? Thank you for watching Whispered Chronicles, Echoes of Forgotten Lore. I would love for you to consider subscribing to the channel, and please share your thoughts below. If the story of a civilization choosing to kill its own name in order to survive, only to have science slowly, patiently resurrect what that name actually meant, if that story stays with you tonight, let it. Let it ask you what names you've been given that you haven't chosen. What identities were assembled for your comfort, or someone else's? What might you reclaim? If you stopped answering to the name the admiring world gave you, history is not the past. It is the machine that built the present, still running, somewhere beneath your feet, in rooms you haven't found yet. We'll keep looking until the next whisper. Stay curious, stay safe.